A soft murmur rippled through the upscale coffee shop, a haven for intellectuals and artists nestled in a bustling corner of downtown Los Angeles. Among the latte sippers and laptop warriors sat Clint Eastwood, the iconic actor-director known for his rugged roles and no-nonsense demeanor. He had chosen this spot for a rare moment of solitude, savoring a cup of black coffee while leafing through a script. He wore his age like a badge of honor, his silver hair neatly combed back and his piercing eyes shielded behind a pair of sunglasses. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. On the far side of the room, a loud voice began to dominate the usual hum of subdued conversations. It belonged to a young journalist, a liberal firebrand named Max Holden. Max had gained notoriety for his sharp wit and relentless critiques of conservative figures in his op-eds. Today, he was holding court with a group of equally vocal friends, their conversation peppered with laughter and exaggerated gestures. Max's attention drifted toward Clint, and a smirk spread across his face. The sight of the legendary filmmaker was too tempting to resist. Max was the kind of man who thrived on confrontations, believing them to be the lifeblood of intellectual discourse. He saw Clint not as a living legend, but as a relic of a bygone era, an easy target for his brand of sharp-tongued humor. "You know," Max began loudly enough for everyone to hear, "it's fascinating to see someone like Clint Eastwood out in public. The man is practically the poster child for toxic masculinity." His words drew a mix of laughter and nervous glances from the surrounding patrons. Clint, for his part, showed no reaction, continuing to study his script as if the noise didn't exist. Emboldened by Clint's apparent indifference, Max leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. I mean, how many times has he played the same stoic, gunslinging tough guy? It's like he spent his entire career auditioning for a Marlboro commercial. And don't get me started on his political views. It's 2025, time to retire the Cowboy Act. The group laughed, but their mirth was tinged with unease. Clint's presence was undeniable, a force that seemed to command respect even in silence. Max, however, mistook Clint's lack of response for weakness, a cue to press harder. "You'd think someone with his resources could do more than cling to outdated ideals," Max continued, his voice gaining an edge. "But I guess when your whole identity is wrapped up in machismo, there's no room for growth." As the words hung in the air, Clint finally stirred. He set the script down gently, removed his sunglasses, and looked directly at Max. The room seemed to hold its collective breath, the tension palpable. Clint's expression was calm, his weathered face betraying no hint of anger. "You done?" he asked, his voice low and measured. It was the kind of voice that could silence a room without rising above a whisper. Max faltered for a moment, caught off guard by the sudden attention. "I'm just saying," Max began, but Clint raised a hand, cutting him off. "Let me tell you a story," Clint said, his gaze unwavering. His tone was not confrontational, but firm, commanding respect through its sheer authenticity. The room, previously buzzing with activity, fell silent as everyone leaned in to listen. "There was a time," Clint began, "when I was just like you, full of opinions, sure of my righteousness, and quick to judge people I didn't understand. I thought I had all the answers because I read the right books and hung out with the right crowd. Sound familiar?" Max shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his smirk fading. Clint's words carried an unexpected weight, cutting through the bravado that had fueled Max's earlier remarks. "But life has a way of humbling you," Clint continued. "It teaches you that the world isn't as black and white as you think. I've played a lot of tough guys, yeah. But those characters, they weren't just about strength. They were about resilience, about standing up for what you believe in even when it's hard. That's not toxic masculinity, son. That's integrity." The room was utterly silent now, the air heavy with anticipation. Max opened his mouth to respond, but Clint wasn't finished. "You criticize what you don't understand," Clint said, his voice tinged with something almost akin to sadness. "You look at me and see an old man stuck in his ways. But you don't see the years, the struggles, the lessons learned the hard way. You don't see the nights spent questioning whether you made the right choices, the friendships lost, the battles fought, both on screen and off." Clint leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving Max. "You think you're brave for speaking your mind, but real bravery is about listening. It's about admitting you might not have all the answers. And it's about respecting the fact that everyone has a story, even the people you disagree with." Max looked down at his hands, the confidence that had defined him moments ago now replaced by uncertainty. Clint let the silence linger before delivering his final words. "Son, it's easy to tear people down. It takes real character to build something, whether it's a career, a legacy, or a meaningful conversation. So, before you judge me or anyone else, ask yourself, what have you built?" Clint leaned back in his chair, his point made. He picked up his script and resumed reading as if nothing had happened. The room remained still, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Max, for once, had nothing to say. His friends avoided his gaze, their earlier laughter now a distant memory. The patrons around them began to stir, conversations resuming in hushed tones. But the energy of the space had shifted, as if everyone present had been touched by the quiet power of Clint's response. Max stood up abruptly, muttering something about needing fresh air. He left the coffee shop without another word, his bravado left behind at the table. His friends followed hesitantly, their expressions a mix of discomfort and newfound respect for the man they had underestimated. Clint remained seated, his focus on the script in his hands. He didn't need to look up to know the impact his words had made. He had spent a lifetime learning the art of timing, both in film and in life, and he understood that sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is simply to speak the truth. As the day wore on, the story of Clint's response began to spread, first among the coffee shop's patrons and then beyond. People marveled at how he had handled the situation, with grace, wisdom, and an unwavering sense of dignity. For Clint, it was just another day, but for Max and those who had witnessed the exchange, it was a moment they wouldn't soon forget. In the days that followed, Max found himself reflecting on Clint's words. He began to question his own approach, his tendency to mock rather than engage, to critique without understanding. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but a seed had been planted, one that would grow in the weeks and months to come, and so Clint Eastwood continued on his path, a man of few words but great impact. He had faced countless challenges in his life, both on and off the screen, but he remained steadfast in his belief that respect and authenticity were the cornerstones of true strength. That day in the coffee shop, he had reminded everyone present of the power of a single, well-placed response and the enduring value of integrity in a world often too quick to judge. Max Holden's departure left a peculiar quietness in the coffee shop. It was not just silence. It was the kind of quiet that arises when something profound lingers in the air, refusing to dissipate. Clint Eastwood, as composed as ever, sipped his coffee and focused on the script in front of him. He didn't bask in the moment or seek validation from those around him. That wasn't his way. For Clint, the truth spoke for itself, and there was no need to amplify it. The patrons in the coffee shop slowly returned to their conversations, though many found themselves revisiting Clint's words, dissecting their meaning and the raw honesty that carried them. A middle-aged woman seated near the counter whispered to her friend, "That was incredible. He didn't raise his voice once, and yet he said everything." Her friend nodded, still processing the encounter. As the day progressed, the tale of Clint's response began to take on a life of its own. One of Max's friends, a photographer named Elena, had recorded the exchange on her phone, intending to laugh about it later. But as she watched the video in private later that evening, she couldn't bring herself to laugh. The calm authority in Clint's voice, his measured tone, and the sheer impact of his words struck a chord within her. Without intending to, she posted the video online, titling it simply, "Clint Eastwood, A Lesson in Dignity." The video gained traction almost immediately. Within hours, it was shared across platforms, garnering comments from people of all political stripes. It wasn't the kind of divisive debate that social media often devolved into. Instead, it sparked discussions about respect, generational differences, and the value of wisdom gained through experience. People quoted Clint's line, "Real bravery is about listening," as if it were a mantra, a much-needed reminder in an era of ceaseless shouting matches. Max, meanwhile, had retreated to his apartment, his confidence shaken. For the first time in years, he found himself unable to articulate his thoughts. He replayed the conversation in his mind, trying to understand why Clint's words had affected him so deeply. He had been mocked before, ridiculed even, and those encounters had only fueled his resolve. But this was different. Clint hadn't humiliated him or shouted him down. He had simply spoken the truth, and in doing so, he had exposed the flaws in Max's approach. In the days that followed, Max avoided his usual haunts. He skipped the panel discussions and social gatherings where he would normally hold court, preferring instead to stay home and reflect. For the first time in his life, he began to question the motivations behind his work. Was he truly seeking justice, or was he simply tearing others down to build himself up? The answer, he realized, wasn't as clear-cut as he had always believed. Clint, unaware of the viral sensation he had become, carried on with his life. He had always been wary of fame, treating it more as a side effect of his work than a goal in itself. He spent his days reading scripts, meeting with collaborators, and indulging in the quiet pleasures that came with age. But even he couldn't remain in the dark forever. A few days after the coffee shop incident, a young assistant on one of his projects approached him, her excitement barely contained. "Mr. Eastwood," she began, holding up her phone, "have you seen this?" Clint squinted at the screen, watching as a younger version of himself, captured just days ago, delivered his impromptu speech to Max. He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "Guess the internet's good for something after all." The assistant beamed, clearly thrilled by his reaction. "People are loving it," she said. "You've got folks talking about respect and decency again. It's refreshing." Clint nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Glad to hear it," he said. "But I wasn't trying to make a statement, just speaking my mind." "That's what makes it so powerful," the assistant replied. "It's real." For Clint, authenticity had always been the cornerstone of his career. Whether he was directing a film or delivering a line, he believed in grounding every moment in truth. It was a philosophy that had served him well, and it seemed it was resonating with a new generation. Meanwhile, Max decided to confront the moment head-on. Rather than shying away from the video, he chose to address it publicly. In an op-ed titled, "What Clint Eastwood Taught Me About Listening," he recounted the coffee shop exchange with unflinching honesty. He described his initial arrogance, his misguided attempt to mock a man he barely knew, and the profound impact of Clint's response. "Clint Eastwood didn't humiliate me," Max wrote. "He humbled me. There's a difference, and it's an important one. Humiliation is about power. Humility is about growth. That day, I learned that the loudest voice in the room isn't always the strongest. Sometimes, strength is quiet. Sometimes it's a man sipping coffee, teaching a lesson without even trying." The article went viral, earning praise for its vulnerability and self-awareness. Readers commended Max for his willingness to admit his mistakes and for using the experience as a catalyst for change. For Max, the piece was more than an apology. It was a turning point. It marked the beginning of a shift in his approach, both as a journalist and as a person. As the weeks turned into months, the ripple effects of the coffee shop encounter continued to spread. Clint's words inspired not just Max, but countless others who saw the video or read the articles about it. Schools used the exchange as a teaching tool, encouraging students to think critically about the way they engage with opposing viewpoints. Community leaders referenced it in speeches, urging their audiences to listen more and judge less. Even Hollywood took notice, with writers and directors citing Clint's response as a reminder of the timeless power of authenticity. Through it all, Clint remained steadfastly humble. When asked about the incident during interviews, he would shrug and say, "I just said what I felt, that's all." But those who knew him best understood that his simplicity was part of his genius. Clint didn't seek to complicate things, he sought to distill them to their essence. In a world that often valued spectacle over substance, his approach was a rare and refreshing anomaly. Max, for his part, began to rebuild his career with a newfound sense of purpose. He shifted his focus from tearing others down to fostering meaningful dialogue. He started a podcast where he invited guests from all walks of life, engaging them in thoughtful, respectful conversations about the issues that mattered most. The podcast, fittingly titled "Listening in Progress," quickly gained a following, with listeners praising Max for his ability to approach even the most contentious topics with an open mind. The coffee shop, too, became something of a legend in its own right. People began visiting the spot, hoping to catch a glimpse of Clint, or simply to soak in the atmosphere of the place where it all happened. The owners, recognizing the significance of the moment, framed a photograph of Clint and hung it near the counter, accompanied by a plaque that read, "Speak the truth even if your voice is calm." And so, the story of Clint Eastwood's quiet wisdom became a part of the cultural fabric, a reminder of the power of authenticity, respect, and humility. For Max, it was a lesson that reshaped his life. For Clint, it was just another example of living by the principles he had always held dear. And for everyone else, it was proof that even in a world filled with noise, one voice, speaking the truth, could still be heard. The coffee shop, once an unassuming corner of Los Angeles, had become a symbol of something much greater, a place where the timeless values of dignity, integrity, and self-reflection had been reinforced by a single exchange. People visited not because of its coffee, though it was good, or its ambiance, though it was cozy, but because it had become a touchstone for a moment of truth that had resonated deeply. Clint Eastwood, despite his years in the limelight, found the growing attention around the incident both amusing and perplexing. In his mind, he hadn't done anything extraordinary. Yet to others, his words had pierced through the noise of modern discourse, a world rife with shouting, outrage, and performative conflict. Clint's quiet confidence, his ability to address a room and a person with sincerity, had become a rarity. What most found exceptional, he viewed as simple decency. The irony was not lost on him when a prominent news outlet requested an interview to discuss the incident. He initially declined, but later reconsidered. He wasn't particularly interested in revisiting the event, but he saw an opportunity to perhaps remind people of something they seemed to have forgotten. That character is forged not in grandstanding, but in understanding. Sitting across from the interviewer, a polished young journalist named Rachel, Clint exuded the same calm presence that had captivated the coffee shop that day. Rachel, despite her composure, couldn't help but feel a touch of nervousness. Here was a man who had defined an era of film, whose every word carried a weight that transcended the screen. "Mr. Eastwood," she began, "the video of your conversation with Max Holden has sparked discussions worldwide. Some are calling it a cultural moment. Did you anticipate such a reaction?" Clint smiled faintly, his gaze steady. "Anticipate it? No. I wasn't trying to create a moment. I was just responding to a situation. If it resonated with people, maybe it's because we've all gotten a little too caught up in making noise and not enough in listening." Rachel leaned forward slightly, sensing the significance of his words. "Do you think that's what people are craving? Listening?" "I think so," Clint replied. "We live in a time where everyone wants to be heard, but not many are willing to hear. Listening doesn't mean you agree with everything you hear, but it shows respect, and respect is the foundation for any real conversation." The interview, aired later that week, quickly became one of the network's most watched segments of the year. Clint's words weren't fiery or controversial, but they were undeniably compelling. People quoted him in their social media posts, and his comments became fodder for think pieces about the state of modern communication. Clint, as always, remained humble about the attention, preferring to let the moment speak for itself. Max Holden, on the other hand, found himself in the midst of a personal renaissance. Clint's words had opened a door he hadn't realized existed, leading him to reevaluate not just his approach to journalism, but his entire worldview. He began reading voraciously, diving into works that challenged his preconceptions and expanded his perspective. He attended lectures, spoke with mentors, and sought out conversations with people whose views differed from his own. One such conversation occurred months after the coffee shop incident, when Max reached out to Clint himself. It wasn't easy to arrange. Clint was notoriously selective about how he spent his time, but Max's sincerity won him over. They met in a quiet park on the outskirts of the city, a place far removed from the noise and chaos of downtown. Clint arrived early, as was his habit, and sat on a weathered bench overlooking a small pond. Max approached cautiously, carrying a notepad and a pen. Though he was known for his confidence, he felt a sense of reverence in Clint's presence. He extended a hand which Clint shook firmly. "Thanks for meeting with me," Max said, his voice tinged with humility. "Didn't think you'd ask," Clint replied, motioning for Max to sit. For a moment, they sat in silence, watching the ripples on the pond. Then Max spoke. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said that day. About listening, about respect. It hit me harder than I expected." Clint nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good. It should." Max chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You don't pull punches, do you?" "Never saw much point in sugarcoating things," Clint said. "But I don't say things to hurt people either. There's a difference." Max took a deep breath. "I've spent a lot of time criticizing people, calling out what I see as flaws or failures. I thought it was my duty as a journalist, you know? hold people accountable. But I realized that somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing people as, well, people. They became targets, headlines, talking points. Clint turned to him, his piercing eyes softened by understanding. Accountability matters, Max, but so does fairness. You can criticize someone's actions without tearing down who they are. That takes balance, and it's not easy, but it's worth it. Their conversation lasted over an hour, covering everything from journalism ethics to personal growth to Clint's experiences in Hollywood. By the end, Max felt a sense of clarity he hadn't known in years. Clint, for his part, saw in Max the potential for real change, a willingness to grow that was all too rare. The meeting marked the beginning of an unlikely friendship. Max and Clint stayed in touch, exchanging letters and occasional phone calls. Their correspondence, though sporadic, was filled with insights and mutual respect. Clint became something of a mentor to Max, not in the traditional sense, but as a guiding presence who encouraged him to think deeper and act with purpose. Meanwhile, the cultural ripples of the coffee shop incident continued to spread. Universities began using the video as a case study in communication and conflict resolution. A well-known think tank even organized a symposium inspired by the exchange, bringing together leaders from various fields to discuss the importance of dialogue in an increasingly polarized world. One of the more unexpected outcomes was the formation of a nonprofit organization called Bridging the Divide. Founded by Elena, the photographer who had posted the video, the organization aimed to promote constructive conversations across ideological lines. They hosted workshops, community events, and online forums designed to foster understanding and empathy. Clint, though he preferred to stay behind the scenes, supported the effort quietly, donating to the cause and offering occasional advice. As the years passed, the story of Clint Eastwood and Max Holden became something of a modern parable, a reminder of the enduring power of authenticity, humility, and the courage to listen. It was a story told not just in classrooms and boardrooms, but in living rooms, coffee shops, and anywhere people sought to connect on a deeper level. For Clint, the legacy of that moment wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about living his values and seeing those values reflected in others. And for Max, it was a reminder that even in the face of failure, growth was always possible. Years passed, and the story of Clint Eastwood's measured response to Max Holden's public critique grew into something akin to a cultural touchstone. It became less about the personalities involved and more about the principles they had come to represent. That single moment in a coffee shop had evolved into a timeless example of how grace under pressure, humility in the face of criticism, and a willingness to reflect could shape not just individuals but entire communities. Clint, now even further into his twilight years, remained a man of few words but many actions. His legacy as a filmmaker, actor, and cultural icon continued to grow, but it was his unshakable commitment to authenticity that people seemed to remember most. He continued working, not out of a need for relevance, but because storytelling was as much a part of him as breathing. His films became even more introspective, exploring themes of reconciliation, understanding, and the complexities of human nature. Audiences recognized that these stories weren't just art, they were a reflection of the man who created them. Max, on the other hand, had transformed into a journalist and public figure, known for his depth and thoughtfulness. He no longer pursued sensationalism or cheap shots at public figures. Instead, he focused on long-form journalism, creating pieces that told the full story of a person, movement, or event. His podcast, Listening in Progress, became a global phenomenon, praised for its nuanced approach to contentious issues. Guests ranged from political figures to community organizers, each given space to share their perspectives without interruption or judgment. One particularly memorable episode featured Clint as a guest. The two men reunited on air, their rapport evident as they reflected on the coffee shop incident and its aftermath. Clint, ever modest, downplayed his role in Max's transformation, attributing it instead to Max's own willingness to evolve. Max, however, insisted that Clint's words had been the catalyst. "That day," Max said during the interview, "you didn't just challenge me, you reminded me of something I'd forgotten. That real strength doesn't come from tearing others down. It comes from standing firm in who you are while being open to the humanity in others." Clint's response was simple but profound. "Glad you figured that out, son. The world could use more of it. The interview was a runaway success, sparking renewed interest in both Clint's work and Max's journey. More importantly, it inspired countless listeners to examine their own lives, questioning whether they were contributing to the noise or to meaningful dialogue. For many, it was a wake-up call, a moment of introspection that led to personal growth. The coffee shop where it all began remained a quiet symbol of the incident. Over time, it had become a sort of pilgrimage site for those inspired by the story. Tourists and locals alike would visit, some leaving notes of gratitude on the corkboard near the counter, others simply sitting in quiet reflection, hoping to channel some of the wisdom that had been shared there. As time moved on, the story of Clint Eastwood and Max Holden settled into a place of quiet reverence in the cultural consciousness. It was no longer trending news or a viral sensation, but a piece of enduring wisdom, referenced in subtle ways by those who valued its message. The essence of that exchange transcended the moment itself, proving that simple truths, delivered with authenticity, could hold lasting power. Clint, now fully retired from public life, had retreated to the serene hills of Carmel, California, a place he had always considered home. The picturesque town, with its rugged coastline and quiet streets, provided him with the solace he sought. Despite stepping away from the spotlight, his influence lingered. Locals would sometimes spot him walking along the beach, his pace steady, his eyes scanning the horizon as if contemplating some unspoken thought. Even in his quiet life, Clint's actions continued to ripple outward. He became a quiet benefactor for organizations promoting civil discourse and mutual understanding. Though he never sought recognition for his contributions, those close to him knew he found satisfaction in supporting efforts that aligned with his values. One such organization, Bridging the Divide, which had grown exponentially since its founding, honored Clint at a private ceremony. True to form, Clint's acceptance of their gratitude was understated. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "You're the ones doing the work. Keep at it." Max, meanwhile, had embraced his new path fully. His transformation was evident not just in his professional endeavors, but also in his personal life. He approached relationships with more care, listening with intent, rather than formulating responses. This shift brought him closer to friends and family, some of whom admitted they had once found his sharpness intimidating. Now, they saw a man who had learned the value of vulnerability, a lesson that had softened his edges without dulling his passion. Max's podcast continued to thrive, branching into live events where audiences could participate in real-time discussions. These gatherings were marked by their civility, a rarity in a world accustomed to heated debates. Max often credited Clint's influence during these events, recounting their coffee shop encounter and the lessons it had taught him. One evening, during a particularly lively Quanda session, an audience member posed a thoughtful question. If you could distill what you learned from Clint Eastwood into a single piece of advice, what would it be? Max paused, a small smile playing on his lips. "It's not about winning the argument," he said. "It's about understanding the person across from you. That doesn't mean you'll agree, but it does mean you'll see them as human, and that makes all the difference." The room erupted in applause, not because the answer was flashy or grandiose, but because it resonated with a deep truth. Max had internalized Clint's lesson and now carried it forward, sharing it with others in his own voice. Back in Carmel, Clint heard about Max's response through a mutual acquaintance. When asked if he wanted to comment, Clint simply smiled. "Looks like he's figured it out," he said, his tone carrying a quiet pride. And so, the legacy of that moment in the coffee shop continued to grow, not as a sensationalized story, but as a reminder that even in the smallest, most unexpected encounters, there exists the potential to change lives and spark understanding. It was proof that wisdom, when shared with humility, could endure far beyond the words themselves. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on a liberal journalist mocking Clint Eastwood in public? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.